My name is Eve Tuck, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to our session. Our session is going to feature new work by two of the freshest doctors on the block. Two highlights of my summer have gotten to see Dr. Billy-Ray Belcourt and Dr. Megan Scribe defend their dissertations. And so we're going to hear some new work from both of them. I am going to serve as the moderator, and I think we have some really important conversations in store. I'll signal that Megan will be talking about difficult work, work that is concerned with the deaths of Indigenous girls and the responsibilities, the carceral responsibilities of the state, the violence of the state in making those deaths happen. And then we're also going to hear work about breathing together and co-conspiring together, and ways that Black and Indigenous peoples might continue to be in relationship with one another. It takes a lot of work to make a strike. I think sometimes anti-union people think of strikes as something that is people trying to get out of work, but that is not true at all. When we are striking, it's because we are striking for our work to be more meaningful. We are striking for our working conditions to be more just. And so it has taken so much work for this strike to happen. Beverly Bain and Minsuk Lee have really shown incredible leadership in organizing this series of teach-ins for this strike. Of course, the strike was initially called for by US scholars Anthea Butler and Kevin Gannon. And we have live captioning today by Megan Linton from Protest Access. And that has happened because of the work of Adil Abdullahi and Ryerson University's School of Disability Studies. We have had some really incredible technical support from Karat Ten Brink, from Okufa, and then volunteers. Today we have Alana, who's helping to moderate the chat. Thank you so much for doing that. And then Rajan and Arthur, other volunteers, and then Ben and Jordan are also part of who are behind the scenes working to make today's teach-in possible. And I am still so in having my heart in my throat by hearing from Dr. Davis and Dr. Johnson in the session just before this. And I recognize the work that so many scholars across these sessions have done to extend relationship. Black and Indigenous scholars really working to try to imagine what life is like outside of constant police violence, outside of constant state violence. And so these sessions, these past 2 days, have really filled me. And of course, we're all still in a pandemic. And so talking about breathing together when so much of our life is restricted and has been constricted by the uneven experiences of Black and Indigenous people with COVID has been really nourishing. In the beginning of an academic year that is stacked with last academic year like never stopped, and now we're starting a new one. And so these 2 days has been really nourishing and really a time to breathe together. So I will welcome Dr. Megan Scribe and Dr. Billy-Ray Belcourt. Today, we will hear a more substantive presentation from Dr. Scribe about your new new research, your new findings, and then we'll also turn to new work from Billy-Ray Belcourt. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. I think now we will turn off our cameras and our mics so that we can hear from Dr. Scribe.
All right. First of all, I am so humbled by the fact that the first time I'm publicly sharing my dissertation research is for such an important movement. I can't think of a better time for this work to make its debut. This project is called Indigenous Girlhood, Narratives of Colonial Care in Law and Literature. And I think it adds an important dimension to our conversation on conspiring against carceral systems. I would like to thank some of the key organizers for Scholar Strike Canada, including Min Suk Lee and Beverly Bain. I also want to acknowledge my co-conspirators, Eve Tuck and Billy-Ray Belcourt, and acknowledge the thousands of scholars who are striking in white settler societies in what is now known as Canada and the United States. The agenda for this presentation includes a discussion on my research questions, the significance, a brief literature review, my methodology, the methods, some of my main findings, an offering or the offerings that I make in this work, and finally, everything that comes next. This research project has been primarily guided by two questions. How is violence against Indigenous girls linked to Canada's ongoing settler colonial regime? And how do stories shape our understanding of violence in the lives of Indigenous girls living in Canada? These questions emerge from concern over the alarming rates of severe to life-threatening forms of violence, disappearance, and death in the lives of Indigenous girls. A significant proportion of those we often refer to as missing and murdered Indigenous women are in fact girls. So to give you a sense of the magnitude, the Native Women's Association of Canada concluded that 55% of missing and murdered Indigenous women documented in their 2010 study were younger than the age of 31, and 17% were 18 years old or younger. A recent Statistics Canada survey found that Indigenous children comprise 52.2% of all Canadian children under the age of 14 in foster care. Furthermore, between 2010 and 2013, researchers found that girls between the ages of 10 and 14 and living on reserve were more likely to die than boys of the same age and location. These same researchers also found that girls between the ages of 15 to 19 had a higher mortality rate than Canadian girls between the same ages. Now, I want to say here that even while I report these disturbing figures, I am mindful of Robert Nichols' caution against relying on the logics of overrepresentation to demonstrate significance. On the surface, it seems straightforward and maybe easy to drop a few figures to demonstrate urgency, but doing so also runs the risk of suggesting that some threshold of acceptable rates of violence exists, which is not at all what I'm suggesting here. And besides, these compelling statistics have not prompted Canada to consider Indigenous girls' experiences when addressing gender-based violence affecting Indigenous peoples anyways. Instead, the state tends to conflate Indigenous girls with Indigenous women in a manner that fails to account for their unique social location and legal minor status. In effect, the continuum of violence that begins in girlhood is rendered invisible. My decision to focus specifically on Indigenous girls comes from the realization that Indigenous girls are situated at the intersection of two of Canada's major strategies of elimination, that is gender-based violence and the systematized attack on Indigenous children. As Canada assumes custodial responsibility over an increasing number of girls in carceral facilities, foster homes and hotels, and contemporary educational boarding arrangements, this study examines how the state is implicated in the deaths of Indigenous girls. The theoretical framework for this project follows what I call a queered Indigenous feminist approach. Let me begin by saying that my work is indebted to those Indigenous feminist activists and academics who insisted on theorizing gender, Indigenous sovereignty, and settler colonialism. My work stands on the shoulders of Indigenous feminists like Paula Gunn Allen, Patricia Montour, Kathleen Jamieson, and Marie Campbell, who argued that gender-based violence is not merely a side effect of settler colonialism, but actually central to the formation of white settler societies. That said, until recently, the subject of Indigenous feminist theory was almost exclusively the Indigenous woman, which has limited my ability to theorize the experiences of Indigenous girls, particularly those girls who identify as transgender or two-spirit. For this reason, I have found it necessary to bring Indigenous feminist theory into conversation with Indigenous queer theory. As a theoretical framework, Indigenous queer theory provides an extensive array of conceptual tools for sustained engagement at the intersection of indigeneity, cis-heteropatriarchy, and settler colonialism. In queering Indigenous feminist theory, I have been well positioned to examine girlhood as a social construct that's informed by nationality, race, gender, class, and ability, which has led for this category to operate in an exclusive way that evicts Indigenous girls in white settler societies. While the methodology guiding this project might best be described as Indigenous feminist storytelling, this work is deeply informed by and indebted to Black feminist scholarship. This project recognizes stories as exceptional transmitters of knowledge and power. Depending on the storyteller, narratives can be deployed for harm or healing. As well, they create, strengthen, and can even dismantle societal structures. My work ambitiously considers all of these possibilities in its examination of legal and literary stories about Indigenous girlhood's experiences here in Canada. To avoid reproducing violence in my analysis, I turn to Indigenous and Black feminist theorists such as Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Eve Tuck, Sadia Hartman, and Christina Sharp for guidance on developing community-informed ethical standards. This project is organized into two major parts. Part one provides a discourse analysis of two legal cases, including the inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the death of Phoenix Sinclair and an inquest into the deaths of 7 First Nation youth. The second part turns towards Indigenous feminist literature with a focus on two influential novels, Birdie by Tracy Lindbergh and The Break by Katharina Vermette. Before I delve into my main findings, let me begin by situating the inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the death of Phoenix Sinclair, a landmark inquiry into the murder of Anishinaabe 5-year-old Phoenix Victoria Hope Sinclair, following her lifelong involvement with Manitoba's child welfare system. For many, the discovery of Phoenix's death came months after it occurred on June 11, 2005. Those who knew and loved Sinclair, however, felt her absence even when her fate remained unknown. It was because of the persistence of Sinclair's loved ones that the young girl's remains were eventually recovered 8 months following her death. And for the next 10 years, the late Phoenix Sinclair would become the subject of countless media reports, official studies, and court proceedings investigating her brief life and brutal death. From the outset, Indigenous community across Manitoba gathered around the bereaved to collectively mourn and demand justice. Given Sinclair's lifelong involvement with Manitoba's child welfare system, family and community advocates demanded to know how the system could allow this young girl to disappear unnoticed under its watchful gaze. It was also pointed out that among all provincially run child welfare systems in Canada, Manitoba's child welfare system is perhaps one of the most notorious, and it is frequently cited for the overwhelming number of Indigenous children and youth in its care, and for the violence that these children and youth experience. Given these circumstances, it was understood that Sinclair's death was not an isolated incident, but reflective of a systemic problem. As part of this call for accountability by Manitoba's child welfare system, demands for an inquiry were made. The inquiry into Phoenix Sinclair's death provides one of the most comprehensive and in-depth examinations of Manitoba's child welfare system. According to Commissioner Ted Hughes, this is one of Manitoba's most expensive inquiries, totaling somewhere between 10 and 14 million. The inquiry began March 2011, 6 years following the young girl's death. It ended on July 2013 with a final report that was released a year later. As part of the inquiry, there is a digital archive housing much of the inquiry documents and information, including the inquiry's mandate, the terms of reference, information about the commissioner's staff, parties and interveners, and transcripts. As well, this archive contains the final report, The Legacy of Phoenix Sinclair, Achieving the Best for All Our Children. And all of these documents are publicly available on the website and can be downloaded as PDFs. The creation and continued existence of this digital archive offers the public a rare and invaluable opportunity to engage with official records that are usually concealed, and as such enables us to learn more about the production of official narratives and what they do. As part of this project, I examined child welfare and legal responses to the life and death of Phoenix to understand the ideological underpinnings and processes by which official narratives are produced. Shifting away from highly sensationalized accounts that often depict gratuitous and graphic violence, I turned my focus to the more everyday bureaucratic encounters documented in the records. Through close reading, I found significant differences in how younger girls were portrayed as compared with their older counterparts. While Phoenix was often depicted as helpless, her biological mother, Samantha Kimech, who was a teenager at the time, tended to be portrayed as difficult or dysfunctional. In both cases, discursive designations are attributed to Indigenous dysfunctionality rather than ongoing settler colonialism. The significance of this finding, I argue, is that each designation determines the kind of state surveillance and intervention girls will receive. For those girls who are deemed helpless, child welfare institutions are called in. For those portrayed as dysfunctional, the state typically intervenes through carceral systems like juvenile detention centers. Throughout this examination, I argued that if we read the inquiry as part of an official narrative, we can see the ways in which these legal mechanisms participate in harming Indigenous girls, while at the same time reinforcing colonial ideologies and institutions. While the subsequent inquiry attempted to establish links between the high rates of Indigenous children in care and Canada's so-called legacy of colonialism, the commissioner ultimately deemed Manitoba's child welfare system as a flawed yet necessary institution that just needed some repair. Let me situate the next inquest that I looked at. The inquest into the deaths of 7 First Nation youth is one of the largest discretionary inquests ever held in Ontario. Initial talks of an inquest into youth deaths began in 2007 following the disappearance and death of Reggie Bushy. With family and community pressure, the inquest scope was eventually expanded to include an examination into the deaths of an additional 6 youth, including Jordan Wabase, Kyle Morrisseau, Paul Panachis, Kern Strang, Jethro Anderson, and Robin Harper. The push to expand the scope was informed by the widely held understanding that these deaths were not isolated incidents, but rather systemic. All of the youth represented in this inquest died under suspicious and violent circumstances shortly after leaving their remote Northern First Nations communities to attend school in Thunder Bay. Long before the inquest, many recognized Thunder Bay as a white settler city that was both hostile towards neighboring First Nations communities and posed many dangers for its Indigenous residents. This, coupled with Canada's historical and contemporary educational policies requiring Indigenous children and youth to leave home for school, led Indigenous families and advocates to push for this inquest. Building on the bad girl trope introduced in my previous chapter, my analysis considers Robin Harper's brief experience in relocating for school and the subsequent legal response to her sudden death. As the only girl identified youth represented by this inquest, I suggest that Harper's experiences can shed greater light on the gender dimensions of contemporary schooling arrangements and the legal responses to her death. Here's what I found. When Indigenous girls are compelled to leave their communities to attend secondary school in nearby cities, they are making a life or death decision. Contemporary educational boarding programs are underfunded reinterpretation of Indian residential schools. Educational boarding programs often require youth to live in dormitories or strangers' homes, to attend schools with racist peers and staff in racist towns and cities. For Indigenous girls, institutional racism is compounded by the systemic hypersexualization of Indigenous femininity. When Indigenous girls experience violence, disappear, or die, officials typically attribute harm to the teen's so-called high-risk lifestyle without any consideration for the factors I just mentioned. In Harper's case, the inquest deemed acute ethanol toxicity to be the cause of death rather than her guardian's negligence. I found that if you read inquests as installments of the official narrative, you can learn a lot about how violence against Indigenous girls advances Canada's settler colonial project. Portraying Indigenous girls as difficult or dysfunctional is an effective tactic for shifting the burden of responsibility from so-called caring professionals onto the girls held in these custodial arrangements. In my research, I found a gross normalization of Indigenous girls' experiences with pain and violence in these narratives. In this storyline, it's often claimed that officials are tasked with this impossible burden of caring for these so-called bad girls, and that while their deaths may be tragic, they're inevitable. Missing from the official story is the history of Indigenous displacement and attempts at genocide. Part 2 of this project begins with Katharina Vermette's The Break, a multi-generational narrative following 4 Métis and Anishinaabe families after the rape of 13-year-old Emily Traverse. Told from the perspective of the investigating police officer and the 4 families living in Winnipeg's North End, the novel sheds greater light on the ways in which sexual violence structures Canada. Organized into 4 parts, each chapter shifts in perspective to gradually retrace the events leading up to the violent attack. However, this is not a straightforward account of events. In the days following, each character must grapple with the implications of the attack while contending with the everyday experiences of settler colonialism and their resurfacing traumatic memories. In deploying this narrative technique, Vermette establishes critical links between sexual violence against Indigenous girls, intergenerational trauma, and existing colonial structures. Through a close reading, I consider the spatiality of sexual colonial violence in the lives of Indigenous girls. In mapping out Indigenous girls' psychic and physical geographies, I found that while sexual violence structures girls' lives, this landscape is also shaped by Indigenous girls' histories, their knowledges, desires, and relationships. With this in mind, I argue that Indigenous girls are not merely navigating the settler colonial terrain. They are co-creators engaged in their own worlding projects. In my analysis, I point out that while legal narratives treat violence as singular and exceptional, Indigenous feminist narratives are more willing and better equipped to establish connections between acts of violence and racist misogyny, displacement, eliminatory policies and laws, and oppressive custodial institutions. Furthermore, I argue that in order to effectively address sexualized violence, these factors must be addressed with the consideration of the entire person or worlds of Indigenous girls. To reduce Indigenous girls to their pain is to risk reproducing violent narratives that often emerge in legal processes. Instead, critical inquiries must include a discussion on Indigenous girls' everyday efforts to navigate and reconfigure the settler colonial terrain. I argue that official narratives are less about healing and justice than about maintaining and exercising colonial power. As this analysis shows, healing, justice, and liberation comes from the relationship that girls have with themselves, their families, communities, and territories. And in this way, I think that as scholars, we have a lot to learn from Indigenous feminist literature. The next novel I turn to is Tracy Lindbergh's Birdie. Through her debut novel, Lindbergh renders a humorous and harrowing story of ancestral sexual violence and how it profoundly affects Indigenous girls, and as an indirect consequence, radically alters kinship formations. By focusing her attention on just one girl and her family, Lindbergh attends to the intersections of child abuse, gender-based violence, and racism to effectively address historical and contemporary eliminatory ideologies, laws, and policies informing Canada's settler colonial project. Furthermore, Lindbergh considers the ways in which settler colonialism must endure against indigeneity by looking at the enduring nature of family, ceremony, and Indigenous law and philosophy. As readers get to know the main character, Bernice Mitus, it quickly becomes clear that she has endured many violations over the course of her lifetime, including neglect, physical, psychological, sexual, and spiritual violence. Through the multifarious forms of violence and oppression, Lindbergh contemplates possible mechanisms for healing and justice by framing these harms as violations of Wukuduin, a Cree law governing extended kinship relations. One possible pathway to healing that Lindbergh offers is Minopamatasoin, a Cree philosophy roughly translating as the good life. Through a close reading, I argue that developing a legal consciousness is critical for addressing sexualized violence in white settler societies. In becoming familiar with and practicing Indigenous law, we ensure the continuity and ongoing development of our ancestral frameworks and dismantle oppressive structures while ensuring something positive is left in place. I extend Lindbergh's argument by emphasizing the importance of Indigenous Two-Spirit and LGBTQ identifying individuals' access and engagement with Indigenous law and philosophy. I argue that in order for these systems to continue, they must remain relevant to every single member of our communities. In my reading of Minopamatasoin, I argue that ceremony and other spiritual practices must be land-based, while state appropriations of Indigenous cultural practices emphasize decontextualized and depoliticized spiritual engagement. My reading of Birdie insists that healing and justice are grounded in place and space. This research makes a number of contributions to the advancement of Indigenous feminist theory, Indigenous queer theory, and critical Indigenous studies, while always remaining committed to effecting positive change in the lives of Indigenous girls and all their relations. Overall, this study has demonstrated how a focus on Indigenous girls' experiences can shed greater light on Canadian settler colonialism by mapping out the multiple interconnected custodial institutions holding Indigenous girls, as well as by examining the discursive depictions on Indigenous girlhood circulating in law and literature. By grounding this project in a discourse analysis of legal documents and proceedings, my researchers provides readers with the tools and skill sets necessary for understanding how transcripts, final reports, and recommendations can advance Canada's settler colonial agenda. In turning to Indigenous feminist literature, this work offers readers a framework for identifying and grappling with the complexity of Canadian settler colonialism. As well, this research presents alternatives to healing and justice outside of Canada's legal system, including Indigenous narrative and knowledge production, land-based cultural and ceremonial practices, reimagining intimate and kinship relations, and Indigenous law and philosophy. And finally, in positioning Indigenous literature as scholarship, I think Indigenous feminist knowledge production becomes more accessible, more interesting, and more authentic to individual and communities' experiences. This research raises some important questions and as a result presents opportunities for further exploration. So here's what's coming next. In future work, I would like to engage more closely with the voices and stories of Indigenous girls. I found that in conducting an analysis of legal narratives violence against these girls only reaches the courts once it's reached its fullest extension, which is disappearance or death. And while I did look for opportunities to highlight girls' narrative interventions through testimony, I do plan to collaborate with and center Indigenous girls more fully. And building from this research, I would like to deepen my analysis of gender-based violence and settler colonialism by working collaboratively with Two-Spirit and LGBTQ identifying youth. Through this work, I hope to draw out the intricacies of cis heteropatriarchy in white settler societies. And with that, I would like to say thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Megan, please don't stop sharing your face though, even though you're stop sharing your screen. So I'm just gonna pause for a moment to allow you to catch your breath and allow any of the people tuning in to make any notes before I move into some discussion with you about what you've just shared with us. So I'll just wait a moment.
Okay.
And maybe if you're tuning in, you can think about what your questions are and also think about why those are your questions and why those are the first questions that come to you after listening to this presentation. Megan, this has been, I've gotten to hear different presentations about your work over the years that we have known each other. And what I have learned so much from you is about how your decision to bring together settler legal proceedings and the narratives that come out of them and the kinds of documentation that is involved in those legal proceedings with Indigenous feminist narratives and fiction about girls, and how that was an ethical choice for you, and why the reasons why are so important for us to draw out in this teach-in. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that, please. Why was it important to address the insufficiency of settler colonial law in that way?
Yeah, of course, and thanks for asking. When I began this program, it was around the time that a lot of Indigenous community members across these territories and elsewhere were calling for national inquiries into missing and murdered Indigenous women. And oftentimes these calls were coupled with the belief that an inquiry would get to the root cause of why so many of our loved ones were being disappeared. But what I had found with other inquests and inquiries and reports that had taken place beforehand is that once they were completed, they often left Indigenous community members feeling really disappointed that somehow Canada, through its legal system, had skirted or barely touched the surface of why violence was happening and why Indigenous women and girls in particular were being subject to all this violence. And so I wanted to think about other ways of getting to the root cause of violence. And I had to go far back into my own training as an Indigenous feminist, which I think began when I was a girl myself. And I remembered reading In Search of April Raintree when I was 12, and that's written by Beatrice Coulton Moisnor. And it was actually, that was the first time in my life, and really since that, I saw, well, what I call scholarship really engaging with violence against Indigenous girls in a meaningful, comprehensive and complex way. And in all of the inquests and inquiries that I had seen since beginning this research project, they just didn't compare in any way. So what I wanted to do in two parts was first show how not only were these colonial frameworks insufficient, but they are actually causing harm. And I really appreciated what Pam Palmater had wrote in her last book, where she said, some people say something is better than nothing, but actually I want to trouble that, because sometimes nothing is better. So I was thinking, we're calling for all these inquiries and inquests and reports, but how are they entrenching colonial violence in really insidious and dangerous ways? So I mapped that out by looking at the digital archive and all the public documents that were available from these two inquests and inquiries. And once I felt like I had traced out how these colonial narratives actually reinforce colonialism, I wanted to shift into a deeper examination of Indigenous literature to show how we are addressing the root causes of violence in our own work, and that we don't need to look outside of our own work necessarily to understand why Indigenous girls and women experience so much harm.
One of the things that I really appreciate about the pedagogical approach of a teach-in is that it invites us to think about a social issue together from wherever we are, wherever our work is addressing or approaching this issue. And so the series of teach-ins and the Scholar Strike Canada that we are both involved in today is concerned with addressing police violence and state violence and anti-Black violence. And I thought to have this conversation today because I think what your work does is it reveals how the experiences of Indigenous girls in carceral systems is very layered. It's not, it's really from birth to death. And so I'd love to hear more from you about the connections and what you learned in this project about carcerality, about the need for abolition, and what those projects might mean for what you found in your work.
Absolutely. So like you say, carcerality, especially in the lives of Indigenous girls, it's layered and overlapping and really difficult to pull apart in a lot of ways. And it does happen from birth and sometimes even beforehand. With my look at the inquiry into the death of Phoenix Sinclair, what I found in the records is that from the moment of that young girl's birth, social workers were already called to question whether she was safe with her family hours after she was born. And through the case file that was created, with the intention of being concerned for this girl, there was also this criminalization that was happening against her parents at the same time. So it's a kind of carcerality that it's embedded in the family structure in really complex ways. So there's this concern for the girl, but then it bleeds into the whole family unit and the whole community in a lot of ways. I think that when I began this work, I had a really narrow idea of what carcerality or custodial violence looked like. When I began the research, I used to think of it in terms of prisons and jails and police cruisers and drunk tanks. But as I delved into more Indigenous literature on girlhood, I found that carcerality can look like foster homes and hotels. It can also look like educational boarding arrangements. And in these ways, it's invisible, it's made invisible, or it's normalized and considered acceptable. I think that when we are thinking about this, about Indigenous girls, there tends to be this this denial of girlhood in a lot of ways. So on one hand, they're being thrust into a kind of adulthood with all of their responsibilities, yet at the same time, they're denied all of the privileges and rights that come with being an adult. And when they experience violence and die, I found that we're missing the fact that Indigenous girls are always held in somebody's custody, whether it's their parents, their guardians, or the state. And when we lose sight of this, we lose sight of the fact that somebody was supposed to be taking care of them. And what's happening increasingly as girls are entering into correction centers or these schools or foster homes is that they're being put in really dangerous situations against their will under the pretenses that it's for their protection.
Mhm. We're going to shift a bit in order to bring Dr. Billy-Ray Belcourt into our conversation. For the next part, the last part of today's session, we're going to really stay with those themes of care and co-relation and turn to some thinking about conspiracy and co-conspiring. And so, Dr. Belcourt, I'd like for you to share with us from the work that you've been doing to think about this.
Yeah, thank you, Eve. So grateful to be here, to have been invited by you to be a part of this conversation, and to Megan for your important work. So in my dissertation, I began with the concept of conspiracy. And I understood this concept in two ways. The first of which was the ways in which Indigenous peoples live lives that in many ways are unintelligible to dominant narratives about Indigenous life. And secondly, by way of its etymology. So coming from the Latin con, meaning together with, and spirare, meaning breath. So I arrived at fugitive breathing. And in many ways, this project was shaped by my own interest in thinking together Indigenous and Black theories of violence and freedom. So in 2016, when I read Christina Sharp's Carceral In the Wake on Blackness and Being, it occurred to me, as it has occurred to many Indigenous scholars, that Indigenous theory without Black studies is a kind of epistemological failure. And so, taking seriously Sharp's argument that anti-Blackness is pervasive as the climate, I wondered then how to nuance our understandings of the machinations of colonization in Indigenous studies. So, as I understand it, Indigenous studies often begins with the concepts of land and law. Normally, the atmosphere, air, doesn't always enter the conversation. It has recently with Kristen Simmons' important concept of settler atmospherics. And in that essay, she's in close conversation with Sharp as well. And so trying to triangulate land, law, and atmosphere, I thought that I ought to go to the place I'm most familiar with, which is Northern Alberta, the Driftpile Cree Nation in particular, and the body of water now called Lesser Slave Lake. But before I get there quickly, the theoretical foundation for this thinking on conspiracy was indebted to Sharp and to Ashon Crawley, who in Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, begins with or attends with a lot of theoretical rigor to the on-air death of Eric Garner at the hands of police officers in Staten Island. And in this examination, Crawley evinces how breathing can constitute a kind of rupture a disruption or an ethical plea vis-a-vis the ethical crisis of anti-Blackness. So breath can be caught up, Crawley argues, in the Western juridical apparatus of violent control, repression, and premature death, and I'm quoting. And Sharp, in the wake, likewise attends to the difficulties of accessing for Black people something like fresh air when the wake is a past that continues to reappear. And I thought about these two pivotal lines of inquiry in relation to the work of another Anishinaabe artist, Fallon Simard, who stylizes a meme with the phrase "I can't breathe" to signify, in my opinion, the ways that troubled breathing is actually a larger condition of colonial anti-Black modernity. And lastly, thinking alongside Karen Recollet, I was and continue to be curious about the ways that the moving body, to use her language, can actually reveal a kind of map to tomorrow, and that there's, in this thinking, an always present eye to futurity. Okay, so let's quickly go to Lesser Slave Lake. I write on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake, a place where history is too much like the wind. Here, history, like air in motion, is not always something to behold, especially when it blurs into the background noise of the ordinary. Nonetheless, it sounds out, and sometimes in competition with a dominant auditory emission. If we think of the present as something like a dominant auditory emission, then this means that we have to strive to hear the low hum of context. As both vibration and wind, excuse me, histories of the atmosphere. In Northern Alberta, the atmosphere is, of course, subarctic, but swept up in it is also the terror of settlement. Bounded and unsafe, it is dense with the alarm of biopower. To the untutored eye, the affect worlds that bubble up at the water's edge and nearby are outside the political, unhinged from the thick history of colonial dispossession that brought and is still bringing Canada into existence. Since at least 1900 and deep into the 60s, this comparatively small pocket of the province was the site of a terrible and terror-making social and necropolitical experiments of epic proportions, the Indian Residential School. Lesser Slave Lake covers just 1,160 square kilometers, but at its western and eastern shores, at Gruard, Joussard, and what is now Lesser Slave Lake Provincial Park, were a total of 4 of the above-mentioned schools throughout the long 20th century, 2 at the same location under different names. What happened in those death worlds is now in the place of non-place of unrepresentability. Surely we can surmise the generics of what horror unraveled there from the testimonial record of those who broke through the sound barrier of Canadian historical ignorance to pronounce a violence that was at once infrastructural, cultural, psychosocial, sexual, and biological, but the trauma that polluted the air of those schools is both more than and contra-representation. State power against joy, against care made trouble for thought and image making. It produced a zone of ethical abandonment that continues to haunt those who make life on the reserves and in the towns and Métis settlements on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake, through which Highway 2 runs. But however tinged the air of a haunted place is with a trauma that is made anew beyond its expiration date, which has heretofore looked like a governmental apology, numerous governmental apologies, a cash payout, and a nationwide set of public engagements, there is always the possibility of another sort of respiration. This is the conspiracy at the heart of my doctoral project, both in the sense of an uninstitutional or fugitive act of collective breath, both in a sense of an uninstitutional or fugitive act and of collective breath. It is not that we can retreat to a space of innocence that is prior to or freed from that overdetermined and overdetermining form of subjugation. Instead, our togetherness, which is both a symptom of and in opposition to the vulgarities of state making, is a cause for celebration. Fred Moten says, the unremitting cause for celebration of that which cannot be celebrated. We cannot abandon the world, but also we already have. This is a paradox with which to agitate social inquiry, not one to hide away, not one to sweep under the rug. In one another's company, we plunge into a debt that is not the debt of those who plunder the world with the well-oiled machines of racial capitalism. In the Undercommons, Moten and Stefano Harney write that debt is mutual. Credit runs one way, but debt runs in every direction, scatters, escapes, seeks refuge. The debtor seeks refuge among other debtors, acquires debt from them, offers debt to them. The place of refuge is the place to which you can only owe more and more because there is no creditor, no payment possible. This refuge, this place of bad debt, is what they call the fugitive public. Joy, as I understand it, is what motors this accrual of debt. It is emotional, it is the emotional house inside which those who are on the run from a past that does not over seek refuge. It is not that joy bears radical possibility in and of itself. Like on the shores of Lesser Slave Lake, indigenous publics everywhere burgeon joy despite the suffocating violence that makes a fool of the lungs. It is the despite that renders joy political. That we laugh and care for one another and watch another's kids and powwow and feast are matters of deep sociological significance, given the brutal history out of which these joyous practices emerge, however incredulously. We are still in the inchoate afterlife of the cruelties of Indian policy. So it is imperative that we nest in and speculate about all of that which is greater than and in contradistinction to that ever-changing, ever-compounding cruelty. We are more than non-beings from the badlands of modernity. We are here at the edge of the world, and there are doorways everywhere. Thank you.
Kagasagon, Billy-Ray, for bringing those ideas to this conversation. I'd like to turn back to Megan Scribe, who is also in some other ways engaging Kristen Simmons' work and also is thinking about this idea of co-conspiring. Megan, I've asked for you to read from a recent essay that you published with another Toronto-based scholar, Safenit Haktom. And we did ask Safenit to join us today, but she wasn't able to join us. And I think that that would be a really beautiful way to bring our session to a close. And so if you might read a bit from that essay, I would love to hear from you. Megan, you are muted.
Of course. Thank you, Billy-Ray, so much. I really appreciate hearing you read all the time. I'm going to read from an essay that I co-wrote with my colleague and friend Safenit Haktom, and it's called "To Breathe Together." And we wrote this after a series of police killings that claimed the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And we wanted to think about the violent conditions that bring Indigenous, Black, and Black Indigenous people together and imagine ways forward. And so this is from the essay. Black and Indigenous relationships are not easy or straightforward. At times, we have let each other down. Other times, we have lost sight of one another, seeking immediate gains over collective liberation. However, entangled within white supremacist settler states, there are many times like now, when it is increasingly clear that our interests and our survival tie us together. The question now is, how will we continue to be in good relation with one another? While some have argued for types of coalition, King suggests that perhaps coalition carries too much baggage to support the kinds of intimacies and connections critical to new kinds of Black and Indigenous futures. The language of coalition, she writes, avoids embodied and particular conversations about who people choose to love, have sex with, fuck, build a life with, and bring into the world toward a decolonial future. Kristen Simmons reminds us that conspire translates from Latin to mean to breathe together, and the type of relations we imagine might take shape as co-conspirators. In this co-breathing, we might challenge what Simmons describes as settler atmospherics, the supposedly natural violence found in settler colonialism and anti-Blackness. Settler atmospherics might include the gas and chemicals that were used to break up Standing Rock and inflicted upon Minnesota demonstrators, the asphyxiation of Eric Garner and George Floyd, and the respiratory impacts of COVID-19 that are felt most significantly in our communities. Like Simmons, we contend that Black, Indigenous, and Black Indigenous peoples cannot breathe in a settler atmosphere, literally or figuratively. During this time when so many Black people are mourning, organizing, and trying to find ways to keep well, we meditate on the ongoing unmaking of this world. For many, COVID-19 has revealed the instability of this capitalist system and the death tolls from pandemic and police violence. This has all revealed anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And for us, it is a reminder of the importance of Black, Indigenous, and Black Indigenous peoples to show up for one another. It has revitalized our desire to unmake this world together. Thank you.
And then Billy-Ray, if you could come back, please. So we just have a few moments before we decide to sign off. And I wanted to invite you both to say anything else that you would like to say. I know that there's so much more to say, but anything else that you'd like to say about this ongoing unmaking of the world, this moment that we're in, and what you see as what allows you to keep breathing. How are you thinking about that? Let's go to Billy-Ray.
Yeah, lately I've been thinking often about Claudia Rankine's definition of loneliness in Don't Let Me Be Lonely, where she says loneliness, yes, it's what we cannot do for each other. And in this particular moment, it seems to me that utopia or abolition or decolonization as a politics means that we do more for each other. It is what we can do for each other. And that the way that, as was mentioned earlier, the pandemic is throwing into relief, or, you know, again and again, things are brought into focus, into crueler focus, but how we need each other in ways that do not necessarily mean immediate proximity. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what we do in the, you know, weeks and months to come as all this violence continues to unfold and be reinvented, and, you know, that our, you know, so our intimacy with brutality doesn't go away despite, you know, social distancing measures, that we need to innovate and continue to conspire in ways that elide state capture.
Megan, do you want to have some words for us?
Maybe just one or two brief, inarticulate sentences. I think that breathing together and being together, it really has to start from a recognition of someone's entire personhood. And thinking of Tiffany Lethalbo King's work and her critique on coalitions, I think that's what really drives me forward, that coalition or the language of coalition in a lot of ways. It's not big enough to hold the kinds of relations that I want to make. And I guess the last thought is that I think in breathing together and imagining decolonial worlds beyond this one, I've learned to become less invested in an idea of like who I was or an identity, and be really open to imagining who I'm going to become and let go and be remade by that. And also, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you for everybody who's tuning in. There's amazing sessions coming later today, and I hope that you can stay with us and keep up these conversations. So long, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, we're offline.
Okay. Thank you.